Here at home, protesters have gathered in Ottawa this weekend to mark the second anniversary of the so-called Freedom Convoy. Organizers say they were in touch with law enforcement while planning the event to ensure it remains safe and lawful. The CBC's Joseph Tunney has more on the protest from Parliament Hill.
Here on Parliament Hill, people have gathered to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of the self-described Freedom Convoy movement. It's been 2 years since police moved in to end the protest. So far today, we've seen dance parties, the cars driving by have been honking, and it wouldn't be a 2-year celebration event without some chanting of the word freedom. Many people, I would say, have turned up today. One of the organizers I spoke to said that people were, he thinks they were inspired to attend when after the federal court found that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was unreasonable and contravened charter rights.
With the recent ruling from Justice Mosley about the invocation of the Emergency Act being unjustified, it was a reason for us to come out and make sure that people know we're still out here, and there we go.
The federal government is appealing that decision, but it definitely adds to the movement here. But a big change, I think, from 2 years ago that people will notice is obviously there aren't cars actually filling up the nearby streets. The organizers that we spoke to said that they've been in contact with police and are planning a safe and lawful event. Joseph Tunney, CBC News, Ottawa.
And joining us with more on today's protest is Michael Kempa. He's an associate professor of criminology at the University of Ottawa. Thanks for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Protesters, as you saw, a gathering in Ottawa there, the second anniversary of the so-called freedom protest. What does it mean to you that people are still willing to come out to protest? Is there still unrest, or are we just simply marking an occasion here?
It drives home the point for me that the original Freedom Convoy protest was always a multi-layered thing. Most of the thousands of people who showed up were here to protest vaccine mandates. But there were always people who were here who were generally against issues of government overreach, concerns about the role of global institutions, such as the World Economic Forum, in governing Canadian society or having a role in influencing Canadian policy, and generally against the role of scientific expertise governing our policy. So 2 years later, with the pandemic restrictions having been removed, those layers still remain. There are still people in Canadian society who are generally not in favor of the way our political dispensation is going.
Are they feeling, you think, just not represented, or that their views are being reflected in what we're seeing in governments across the country? As you say, a lot of what they were protesting against has long gone, but does their dissatisfaction still remain?
Well, there's sort of a scale of people who are involved. If you picture a kind of triangle that's wider at the base, there are many people who just feel excluded from Canadian political process. They feel let down by our political leadership. They point to things like ethical lapses. They point to things like the erosion of trust in our voting system and allegations of foreign interference. But as you move up, there are a smaller number of very angry people who not only feel excluded, but become more radical in their ideology and who are willing to use violence to achieve their aims. Now, that's at the extreme tip of that very constricted triangle, but they are a concern, and they're always looking to recruit that larger number of people who are simply angry or who feel left down by the state.
Yeah, and we heard from our reporter there just before we spoke with you about, the contingent of people that are there almost in celebration of that federal court ruling that the government broke the law by invoking the Emergencies Act. What effect do you think that had on bolstering this movement?
Well, very significant, because they now have a legal decision that basically proves their position that the government was wrong to invoke the Emergencies Act. Now, I was a little bit surprised by Justice Mosley's ruling, in the sense that, like Paul Rouleau, who led the inquiry, I had taken a more living law interpretation of the Act, which was more in keeping with the original intention that the government and CSIS are not to be held to precisely the same standards on the basis that the government answers directly to the people, whereas CSIS answers almost to no one. However, the courts have said that by black letter law, exactly as it's written, the government will be held to exactly the same standards as CSIS. And even though that may not make a lot of sense, the only remedy is to change the law as it's written, not have the courts do that dirty work for you.
And you mentioned in that op-ed that you wrote about that change of heart, and mentioning that, you know, there should be an update, as you say, to the Emergencies Act. How can the Act be updated now? How can it be improved going forward?
Well, if you go back to the public inquiry, all of the experts who pretty much testified are of the view that those famous CSIS standards for whether or not the Emergencies Act can be invoked should really be removed. It should be very difficult for the government to invoke the Emergencies Act, but it's not the same thing. It's a political decision for which the government must answer, as opposed to a technical legal decision that CSIS must answer before it engages in surveillance over any of us. So change those standards and also include things like significant forms of interruption to economic stability. So if you've got, for example, a national protest that were to say shut down the rail lines, if that threatens the economy to the point that people's livelihoods could be threatened in large number, that could constitute a form of political violence, economic violence, and could be the type of thing that could allow for the mobilization of emergency powers. This is a very generally held opinion amongst experts who are calling for reform to the Emergencies Act.
And we certainly saw that disruption economically 2 years ago. A far cry today, what we're looking at there on Parliament Hill. Michael Kempa, thank you for your thoughts on this today.
Thank you kindly.